The moment my mother-in-law looked straight at my 8-year-old son during our Easter lunch and said, "That boy was a mistake from the beginning," every fork on the table stopped moving. Why would she say something so cruel in front of our entire family? Why did my husband suddenly refuse to meet my eyes? And why did the hospital choose that exact second to send me a notification labeled "Final Genetic Report"? Before I could even open the file, a pediatric specialist standing only a few feet away glanced at the screen and quietly said, "Mrs. Olson, this report may finally explain what someone has been hiding for years. If you're watching from somewhere in the world, I'd love to know where you're joining from. Tell me your country and your local time in the comments. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about family truth and standing up for the people you love, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe and follow along." I used to believe that becoming part of the Olsen family was the luckiest thing that had ever happened to me. Ryan and I met when we were both 26. I was finishing my clinical training to become a pediatric nurse practitioner, and he had just accepted a position as a civil engineer with a regional construction firm in Columbus, Ohio. We weren't dramatic people. We liked quiet weekends, neighborhood coffee shops, and long walks with our golden retriever before Ethan was born. We built our relationship on routines that felt ordinary, and I loved that. When Ryan proposed after 2 years together, his mother, Margaret Olson, hugged me so tightly that I thought I'd found the warm, supportive mother-in-law every woman hoped for. "I've always wanted a daughter," she told me that night. Looking back now, I realize she never wanted a daughter. She wanted someone willing to fit into the role she had already written. Margaret was the kind of woman everyone admired. She chaired charity galas. She organized church fundraisers every Easter and Christmas. She remembered every birthday, every anniversary, every graduation. People described her with words like generous, elegant, dependable. No one ever called her controlling. Not because she wasn't, because she was exceptionally good at making control feel like kindness. Whenever she offered help, it came wrapped in gratitude. You were expected to repay forever. When Ryan and I bought our first house, she insisted on paying for new kitchen appliances. "You two are just starting out," she said with a smile. A month later, she began referring to our kitchen as the one I practically furnished. When we declined her suggestion to repaint the cabinets white, she sighed dramatically. "I suppose my opinion doesn't matter after everything I've done." Ryan laughed it off. "Mom's just sensitive." That became the explanation for everything. Mom's just sensitive. Mom worries too much. Mom didn't mean it. Mom comes from a different generation. Each excuse sounded harmless by itself. Together, they built a wall that made it almost impossible to challenge her. I noticed the pattern long before Ryan did. Whenever Margaret wanted something, she rarely asked directly. Instead, she'd tell everyone how disappointed she felt, how lonely she was, how much she'd sacrificed for the family. Within minutes, someone else would volunteer exactly what she wanted. She never had to demand loyalty. People offered it willingly because they didn't want to feel guilty. As someone who worked in pediatrics, I saw emotional patterns every day. Children often learned that love depended on pleasing adults. What unsettled me was realizing that Ryan had grown up exactly that way. His first instinct wasn't to ask whether something was right. It was to ask whether his mother would be upset. For the first 2 years of our marriage, I convinced myself it wasn't a serious problem. Then I became pregnant. Margaret suddenly developed opinions about every decision I made. She questioned my work schedule, she questioned my diet, she questioned how often I exercised. One afternoon, she walked into our kitchen, looked at the yogurt in my hand, and frowned. "Are you sure that's healthy enough for the baby?" I smiled politely. "My OB is very happy with everything." She nodded. "I'm just saying, mothers sometimes think they know better than doctors." The irony of hearing that while wearing my hospital badge wasn't lost on me. Ryan kissed my forehead before leaving for work. She means well. Again, she means well. Ethan was born after an uncomplicated pregnancy and a normal delivery. For the first 18 months, everything seemed perfectly ordinary. Then little things started happening. He tired more easily than other toddlers. He occasionally complained that his legs hurt after playing outside. Sometimes he'd become unusually thirsty for no obvious reason. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that pointed clearly toward one diagnosis. As both his mother and a pediatric nurse practitioner, I knew that children sometimes developed slowly in different areas. Still, I documented everything: dates, symptoms, photos, weight changes, questions for every pediatric appointment. Our doctor appreciated how organized I was. Margaret did not. She rolled her eyes whenever I opened my notebook. You medical people always assume the worst. I don't assume, I answered calmly. I document. She laughed as though I had told a joke. You've always been anxious. That surprised me. I'd never considered myself anxious. Careful, absolutely. Prepared always. But anxious, no. Over time, her comments became less subtle. If you weren't constantly taking him to specialists, maybe he wouldn't think something's wrong. Boys are supposed to be energetic. Children copy their mothers. Every statement carried the same hidden message. If Ethan had a problem, it somehow traced back to me. Ryan hated confrontation. Whenever his mother criticized me, he'd wait until we were driving home. I'm sorry. I know. She shouldn't have said that. I know. But she's worried. That sentence became harder to hear every year, because worrying doesn't sound like blame. Yet blame was exactly what Margaret kept delivering. When Ethan turned 4, his symptoms became harder to ignore. He had unexplained fatigue, occasional dizziness, unexpected drops in energy after normal activities. We met with specialists, ran blood work, scheduled follow-up appointments. Every physician took our concerns seriously. Margaret acted offended. You keep dragging that poor boy through hospitals. I'm trying to find answers, I replied. She folded her arms. Or maybe you're trying to prove something is wrong. Those words stayed with me far longer than they should have. Not because I believed her, because Ethan was beginning to hear them. Children absorb far more than adults realize. One evening after another appointment, Ethan climbed into my lap while I was reading. He looked unusually quiet. Mom. Yes, sweetheart. Grandma says doctors only look for problems when moms worry too much. My heart broke. I brushed his hair away from his forehead. What do you think? He shrugged. I don't know. I just don't want to be bad. I wrapped both arms around him immediately. You are not bad. You are not broken. And none of this is your fault. He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't completely convinced. From that day forward, I became even more careful about how often Margaret was alone with him. She never openly insulted him. Not then. Instead, she planted tiny ideas. You need to be tougher. Don't make your mom worry. You've always been a sensitive little guy. On the surface, none of those comments sounded alarming. Together, they taught my son that being sick was somehow a personal failure. As the years passed, our pediatric team recommended more specialized testing. One appointment led to another. Each result ruled something out while raising new questions. During nearly every visit, the physician asked the same routine question. Any significant endocrine disorders or inherited metabolic conditions on either side of the family? Before Ryan or I could answer, Margaret almost always spoke first if she happened to be there. No. She answered so quickly that it sounded rehearsed. No family history at all. The first few times I didn't think much about it. Many families simply didn't know their medical history, but eventually I noticed something that bothered me. Every time that question came up, Margaret's smile disappeared. Her shoulders stiffened. She'd grip the strap of her purse just a little tighter, then she'd change the subject almost immediately. Once Dr. Benjamin Carter looked directly at Ryan. "Are you sure there's nothing on your father's side?" Ryan hesitated for only a second. "I don't think so," Margaret answered before anyone else could. "Absolutely not." Her tone was sharper than usual, almost defensive. Dr. Carter simply nodded and continued the appointment, but I caught something in his expression. He had noticed it too. At the time, I dismissed the feeling. I told myself I was reading too much into a tired grandmother's behavior. Now I know that was the moment the truth almost revealed itself. And 8 years later, as I stared at the words "final genetic report" glowing on my phone during Easter lunch, that memory came rushing back with astonishing clarity. For the first time, I wasn't asking whether my mother-in-law had unfairly blamed me. I was asking why she had always been so determined to answer one particular medical question before anyone else ever had the chance. The ride from the restaurant to Nationwide Children's Hospital took less than 20 minutes. It felt like 2 hours. Ryan drove in complete silence. His hands stayed fixed at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, gripping it so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Every few minutes he glanced toward me, clearly wanting to say something, but the words never came. Ethan sat quietly in the back seat. Normally, he would have been talking about the Easter eggs he'd collected, or asking whether we could stop for ice cream on the way home. Instead, he leaned his head against the window and stared outside. I kept hearing Margaret's voice. "That boy was a mistake from the beginning. Not your pregnancy, not your timing, not your decision." She had looked directly at Ethan when she said it. As a mother, there are moments when anger disappears because something even stronger takes its place. Protection. That was all I felt now. Nothing mattered except making sure my son never believed those words. Dr. Benjamin Carter was already waiting for us. He had changed out of the sport coat he'd worn at the restaurant and was back in a white lab coat with a hospital badge clipped neatly to the pocket. He greeted Ethan first. "Hey, buddy." Ethan managed a small smile. "Hi. You hungry?" "A little." Dr. Carter reached into a cabinet and handed him a package of crackers. "I've got boring adult conversations to have with your parents. Think you can help me finish these?" Ethan nodded immediately. It wasn't really about the crackers. It was Dr. Carter's way of reminding Ethan that he wasn't the problem in the room. After Ethan settled into a chair with an iPad a nurse had brought him, Dr. Carter invited Ryan and me into a consultation office. A woman in her early 40s was already there. She stood and extended her hand. "I'm Emily Foster. I'm the genetic counselor who's been reviewing Ethan's case." Her voice was calm without sounding detached. I'd worked with enough specialists over the years to recognize someone who knew how to deliver difficult information without making families panic. Emily placed a thick folder on the table. "I know you've been waiting several weeks for the final sequencing results." I nodded. "I've checked the portal every day. I figured." She smiled gently. "Parents always do." Then she opened the report. "We finally have an answer." Those 6 words landed with surprising force. Not a suspicion, not another possibility. An answer. Emily turned the first page toward us. "This confirms that Ethan has a rare inherited endocrine disorder caused by a pathogenic genetic variant." Ryan frowned. "So, he was born with it?" "Yes." "Could anything have prevented it?" Emily shook her head. "No." Her answer came without hesitation. "No medication. No diet. No activity during pregnancy. No choice Mrs. Olson made." I felt my shoulders relax for the first time in years. I hadn't realized how much blame I'd been carrying until someone with authority removed it completely. Emily continued. This condition develops because of an inherited genetic change. It exists from conception. Ryan looked at me. I could see guilt beginning to replace confusion. He whispered. I'm sorry. I squeezed his hand. We'll talk later. Right now I wanted facts. Nothing but facts. I pointed to the highlighted section of the report. Can you explain this? Emily nodded. The genetic variant appears on Ethan's paternal side. Ryan blinked. What does that mean? It means the mutation was inherited through your family's genetic line. Silence. Not the awkward kind, the heavy kind that changes people. Ryan stared at the paper as though he couldn't understand the words anymore. My family, Emily nodded again. Everything we know from the testing points to the paternal lineage. He leaned back in his chair. My mother always said... He stopped talking. Emily didn't interrupt him. Instead, she asked softly, What did she say? Ryan swallowed. She always told us there wasn't anything like this in our family. Emily exchanged a brief glance with Dr. Carter. Neither of them looked surprised. Dr. Carter folded his hands together. That's actually something I'd like to discuss. He pulled another folder from the cabinet behind him. This isn't part of the genetic report. It's Ethan's medical record. I recognized the blue cover immediately, the first hospital file we'd started years ago. Dr. Carter opened it carefully. As physicians, we ask every family essentially the same question. He smiled slightly. You've probably memorized it by now. I laughed despite everything. I probably have. Any significant hereditary conditions on either side of the family? Exactly. He tapped several pages. Every appointment, every specialist, every intake form. I noticed something. Ryan looked confused. What? Dr. Carter slid photocopies across the table. The answers. At first glance, they all looked ordinary. Boxes, dates, signatures. Then I noticed one detail. Different doctors, different years, same handwriting, same signature, Margaret Olson. Every single time. My stomach tightened. I never paid attention to that. Dr. Carter nodded. Most parents don't. Grandparents often help with appointments. It's common. But what caught my attention wasn't that your mother signed. It was that every single form listed exactly the same answer. He pointed to the line. No known hereditary endocrine disorders. Again, and again, and again. Page after page. Ryan rubbed both hands across his face. I don't understand, Emily answered quietly. If your mother genuinely believed there was no family history, this would simply be an unfortunate misunderstanding. She paused. But there's another possibility. I already knew what she was about to say. She knew. Emily didn't answer immediately. Instead, she chose her words carefully. We don't accuse people without evidence. But accurate family history is extremely important. It guides physicians toward the right testing. Dr. Carter leaned forward. Sometimes years earlier. Ryan looked physically ill. Are you saying Ethan could have been diagnosed sooner? Dr. Carter was equally careful. I'm saying complete information often shortens the diagnostic process. We can't calculate exactly how much time, but missing history can delay recognition. I closed my eyes. 8 years. 8 years of appointments, blood draws, MRI scans, specialists, questions. Watching my son wonder why his body didn't work like everyone else's. If someone had known, if someone had simply told the truth, how different would those years have been? Ryan stood and walked toward the window. My dad, his voice cracked. My dad had health problems. I looked up. He rarely talked about his father. He was always tired. Ryan continued staring outside. He'd complain about muscle weakness. He fainted twice when I was in high school. My mom always said stress caused it. He turned slowly toward us. I believed her. Dr. Carter asked gently, "Was your father ever evaluated by an endocrinologist?" Ryan frowned. "I honestly don't know." Then his expression changed. "I remember," he spoke almost to himself, "there was one appointment. My dad wanted more testing. My mother argued with him in the kitchen afterward." "What did she say?" I asked. Ryan closed his eyes, searching his memory. "She said, 'We're not putting that label on this family.'" No one spoke. Emily finally broke the silence. "Mr. Olson, if there are older medical records from your father, they could answer important questions." Before Ryan could respond, someone knocked on the office door. A records technician stepped inside, carrying a worn brown archive box. "Dr. Carter, we found the original intake documents from Ethan's first admission." He accepted the box and looked at the faded label. The file was nearly 5 years older than the digital records we'd just reviewed. He carefully lifted the lid. Resting on top was a yellow intake packet held together with a rusted paper clip. Across the front, in bold black ink, was one familiar signature: Margaret Olson. Dr. Carter didn't open the folder immediately. Instead, he looked at Ryan and me as if he wanted to make sure we understood what we were about to see. "I need to say this first," he said. "Finding an old document doesn't automatically prove intent. People forget details. Families misunderstand diagnoses. Medicine changes. We have to separate facts from assumptions." I appreciated that. It was exactly how I had practiced medicine throughout my own career. Evidence first, conclusions second. Ryan slowly sat back down. "I just want the truth." "So do we," Dr. Carter replied. He carefully unfolded the brittle paperwork. The forms were older than our digital records, filled out by hand during Ethan's very first hospitalization after a frightening episode of severe dehydration and unexplained hormone imbalance when he was 3 years old. I remembered that week vividly. Ryan had been traveling for work in Cincinnati when Ethan suddenly became lethargic. His pediatrician had sent us straight to the emergency department. Margaret insisted on meeting us there. "I'll help with the paperwork," she'd said. At the time, I was far more focused on my son than on admission forms. Now I wished I had looked over every single page myself. Dr. Carter spread the documents across the conference table. There were consent forms, insurance information, medication lists, emergency contacts. Then he found the family history questionnaire. "This is the one," he said quietly. My pulse quickened. Near the middle of the page was a familiar section: known hereditary conditions. Below it, several categories had been listed: heart disease, diabetes, neurological disorders, endocrine disorders, cancer. Next to endocrine disorders, someone had neatly checked none known. The handwriting belonged to Margaret. I recognized the rounded capital M in Margaret before I even looked at the signature. Ryan leaned closer. "That's definitely Mom's writing." Dr. Carter nodded. "Do you see this note in the margin?" We all looked. In blue ink, one of the admitting physicians had written, "Grandmother answered family history. Parents unavailable during intake." I frowned. "That's not accurate." Ryan looked confused. "What do you mean, I was there?" I pointed to the note. "I was sitting beside Ethan when they started the paperwork." The memory became clearer with every passing second. I remember a nurse taking him for blood work. I followed. "Your mom said she'd finish the forms while I stayed with Ethan." Ryan closed his eyes. I remember arriving later that evening. Everything fit, not because of speculation, because of timing. Dr. Carter continued turning pages. Another form appeared. This one surprised me even more. It was a recommendation from the consulting endocrinologist. He read it aloud. Given the patient's presentation and limited explanation for symptoms, recommend obtaining additional detailed paternal family history. Consider referral for genetic evaluation if significant endocrine history becomes available. I blinked. I've never seen that. You probably weren't given this copy, Dr. Carter answered. It remained in the hospital chart. Ryan looked stunned. So, someone suspected this years ago? They suspected there might be more to learn, Dr. Carter corrected. That's different. Again, he refused to overstate the evidence. That made me trust him even more. He reached for another page. Stapled behind the recommendation was a follow-up notation dated 3 days later. Family reports no relevant paternal history. Genetic evaluation deferred at this time. Ryan stared at the paper. No. His voice barely came out. No. He looked toward me. My father. He was constantly seeing doctors. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. We don't know what they were treating. Not yet. He nodded slowly. You've always said that. What? Evidence first. I smiled faintly. I have. For years, I'd repeated that phrase to anxious parents whose children were waiting for diagnoses. Now, I needed to hear it myself. Evidence first. Emotion later. Dr. Carter closed the chart. This explains why Ethan wasn't referred for comprehensive genetic testing at age 3. Emily Foster added gently, medicine has also advanced considerably over the past several years. Earlier testing might not have produced today's level of detail. She paused. But complete family history still would have changed how physicians approached his case. There was a difference. No one was claiming certainty. They were explaining probability. That mattered. As healthcare professionals, neither of them was interested in assigning blame. They were interested in understanding what had happened. Ryan suddenly asked a question neither of us had considered. Can someone change information after it's entered? Dr. Carter shook his head, not without leaving a record. What about paper files? Original forms are preserved. So these, Ryan looked down again, they're exactly as they were. Yes. I took a slow breath. For years, I'd questioned my own memory. Margaret had a remarkable ability to make people doubt themselves. If I remembered a conversation one way, she'd remember it another. If I recalled something she'd said, she'd insist I misunderstood. Eventually, I stopped arguing, not because she convinced me, because I became exhausted. But pieces of the past were beginning to rearrange themselves. One memory surfaced so suddenly it made me sit upright. Ryan. He looked at me. Do you remember your father's 50th birthday? He frowned. The dinner at Aunt Diane's? Yes. I remember your dad leaving early. So do I. I stared at the table. There was a conversation in the kitchen. Ryan searched his memory. I wasn't there. No. You were helping outside. I walked in to refill Ethan's bottle. Margaret and your father were talking, not arguing, talking quietly. Your father said, I stopped. The words came back almost perfectly. Maybe the doctors were right. Maybe the boys should know. Ryan's eyebrows drew together. The boys? I assumed he meant you and your cousin. What did Mom say? I could still hear her voice, firm, almost angry. We're not digging up old medical stories. They're better off without that burden. At the time, I thought they were discussing cholesterol or blood pressure. Families have private conversations all the time. Nothing about it had seemed unusual. Until now. Ryan leaned back in his chair. I completely forgot about that. I did too. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, Emily asked, Is there anyone from your husband's side of the family who might remember older medical events? Ryan answered immediately. My Aunt Diane. The oldest sibling. She handled a lot of Dad's appointments after Grandpa died. Emily nodded. She may be able to fill in some gaps. Dr. Carter closed the archive box. I think that's your next step. As we gathered the papers, a nurse entered with another folder. I almost forgot, she said. We found one more item in storage. She handed it to Dr. Carter. Unlike the hospital records, this wasn't part of Ethan's chart. It was a faded envelope addressed to Dr. Leonard Price, an endocrinologist who had retired years earlier. Across the front, someone had written in red ink, Patient declined follow-up. Family requested records returned. Inside the envelope was a photocopy of a referral letter. The patient wasn't Ethan. It wasn't Ryan. The name typed across the top froze all of us. Thomas Olson, Ryan's late father. For several seconds, no one touched the letter. Ryan stared at his father's name as though it belonged to a stranger. Thomas Olson had been gone for almost 11 years. To Ethan, he was nothing more than a framed photograph sitting on a bookshelf in Margaret's living room. To Ryan, he had been a quiet, hardworking father who rarely complained. To me, he had always seemed tired. At family dinners, Thomas would often excuse himself before dessert. He'd smile apologetically and rub the back of his neck. Long week, he'd say. Margaret always answered before anyone else could. He's been pushing himself too hard. No one questioned it. Why would we people get tired? People work long hours. People grow older. Nothing about it had seemed extraordinary at the time. Now every memory demanded a second look. Dr. Carter carefully unfolded the referral letter. The paper had yellowed with age, but the print remained perfectly readable. It was dated nearly 16 years earlier. Ryan leaned closer. That's before we got married. Dr. Carter nodded. It appears your father was referred to an endocrinologist by his primary care physician. He began reading. Mr. Thomas Olson presents with recurrent episodes of unexplained fatigue, intermittent muscle weakness, electrolyte abnormalities, and concern for possible hereditary endocrine disorder. Recommend comprehensive endocrine evaluation and consideration of genetic counseling depending on family history. The room became silent again. Ryan rubbed his forehead. Those are almost the exact symptoms Ethan had. Some of them, Dr. Carter corrected gently. They're similar, not necessarily identical. Emily Foster added, genetic disorders can appear differently from one generation to another. That's one reason family history is so valuable. Ryan looked at the bottom of the letter. There should have been a follow-up. There usually is, Emily replied. But this copy only tells us the referral was written. Dr. Carter reached into the envelope again. There is one more page. It was a handwritten note from Dr. Leonard Price's office. The note wasn't dramatic. In fact, its simplicity made it more unsettling. Appointment canceled by family representative. Patient does not wish to proceed. Ryan frowned. My dad hated canceling medical appointments. You know that? I asked. He nodded immediately. He missed work for appointments. He'd drive across town if a doctor thought something was important. This doesn't sound like him. Emily asked quietly, did he ever mention wanting answers? Ryan didn't answer right away. Instead, he laughed softly, not because anything was funny, because memories sometimes arrive in pieces. I was 19. My dad and I were changing the brakes on my first truck. He told me. Ryan stopped. What did he say? I asked. He said there were things about getting older that didn't make sense. He couldn't understand why his body didn't recover the way it used to. I joked that he was becoming an old man. Ryan smiled sadly. He laughed. Then he said, Ryan looked down at the referral letter. Maybe one day you'll figure out what's been wrong with the Olsen men. A chill ran through me, not because it proved anything, because it suggested Thomas himself suspected there was an underlying pattern. Dr. Carter folded the document carefully. We still don't know why the appointment was canceled. No, Ryan agreed, but we know he wanted one. That distinction mattered. Evidence, not assumptions, exactly as we'd promised ourselves. As we left the consultation room, Emily stopped me. Mrs. Olsen. Yes, there may be someone who can answer questions these records can't. Who? Your husband's aunt. Diane. Emily nodded. If anyone remembers your father-in-law's medical history accurately, it's probably the family member who accompanied him to appointments. Ryan overheard the conversation. I haven't talked to Aunt Diane in months. Why not? He looked embarrassed. Mom and Aunt Diane don't really get along anymore. That surprised me. I never knew that. It happened after Dad died. Mom always said Aunt Diane liked creating family drama. The sentence hung in the air. Creating family drama. It sounded strangely familiar. Whenever someone disagreed with Margaret, that was always the explanation. They're dramatic. They're emotional. They're confused. I'd heard those phrases for years. Maybe I should have paid closer attention to who kept receiving those labels. The next afternoon, Ryan called Diane Mitchell. She answered on the second ring. Ryan? There was genuine warmth in her voice. I've been thinking about you. He hesitated. I need to ask you something about Dad. Silence. Not uncomfortable. Heavy. I wondered if this day would ever come, she finally said. She invited us to her house that evening. Diane lived about 30 minutes outside Columbus in the home she'd shared with her late husband for nearly 40 years. The house looked exactly as I remembered. Flower beds lining the walkway, an American flag on the porch, family photographs covering nearly every wall inside. She hugged Ryan tightly, then she hugged me, and finally she knelt to Ethan's level. I hear you've been very brave. Ethan smiled shyly. I'm trying. I can tell. She led us into the living room. Coffee was already waiting. So were 3 cardboard storage boxes. Ryan noticed them immediately. Aunt Diane. She nodded. I figured you weren't coming here for coffee. She sat across from us. I've kept these since your father passed away. Margaret had apparently never asked for them. Or perhaps she'd never known they existed. Diane lifted the lid from the first box. Inside were neatly organized folders. Medical bills, insurance statements, appointment calendars, prescription receipts. Ryan looked stunned. You kept all this? Your father asked me to. He said someone might need it someday. That sentence made every hair on my arms stand up. Diane opened a folder labeled Thomas, medical. There are things I didn't understand back then. She looked directly at Ryan. But your father believed something ran in our family. Ryan swallowed hard. Did Mom know? Diane sighed. Oh, she knew he was worried. Did she know what the doctors suspected? Diane didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into the folder and removed a folded sheet of paper. This is why I never threw any of it away. She handed it to Ryan. It wasn't a diagnosis. It wasn't even a medical record. It was a handwritten note in Thomas Olsen's own handwriting. Ryan unfolded it carefully. His father's writing was unmistakable. Across the top were just 8 words. If anything happens to me, don't stop looking. Ryan's eyes immediately filled with tears. I reached for his hand beneath the table. Diane spoke softly. Your father wasn't afraid of the truth. He was afraid he'd never live long enough to find it. She looked toward Ethan. I think I finally understand who he was trying to protect. Ryan carefully turned the note over. Something had been clipped behind it. A second sheet. Older, yellowed, official. At the top was the logo of an endocrinology clinic. Near the center, one sentence had been highlighted decades ago. Family genetic counseling strongly recommended for first-degree relatives. Ryan held the recommendation letter in both hands as though it might fall apart if he breathed too hard. No one spoke for nearly a minute. The only sound in Aunt Diane's living room was the old grandfather clock in the hallway marking each passing second. Finally, Ryan looked up. You've had this all these years. Diane nodded slowly. I promised your father I wouldn't throw anything away. Why didn't you tell me? I tried. Her answer came without anger, just sadness. I tried more than once. Ryan frowned. I don't remember. You wouldn't. She folded her hands in her lap. Because every time I brought it up, your mother was there. I watched Ryan's expression change. Not disbelief, recognition. Diane continued. The first time was after Thomas's funeral. You were overwhelmed. So was everyone else. I told your mother these papers might matter someday. Ryan looked at her. What did she say? Diane sighed. She told me your father had become obsessed with finding illnesses that weren't there. I felt my stomach tighten. That was almost word for word what Margaret had spent years saying about me. Diane looked at Ethan, who was quietly coloring at the dining room table. Then she lowered her voice. She said the best thing for the family was to move on. Ryan slowly lowered his head. I believed her. I know. You always believed the best about people. There wasn't any accusation in Diane's voice, only compassion. She opened the second storage box. Unlike the first, it wasn't filled with medical records. It contained calendars, old planners, greeting cards, receipts, even grocery lists. Ryan looked confused. Why keep these? Because your father wrote everything down. I smiled without thinking. So do I. Diane smiled back. He would have liked that about you. She flipped through one of Thomas's appointment planners. Small notes had been written in nearly every margin. Check lab. Call insurance. Ask about fatigue. Bring medication list. Then she stopped on a page dated October 14. A single sentence had been circled twice. Margaret doesn't want Ryan worrying. Ryan whispered, I've never seen any of this. Diane nodded. I know. She turned another page. A few weeks later, another note appeared. Canceled specialist, argument afterward. Ryan stared at it. I remember they argued that night. You do. I was upstairs. I couldn't hear what they were saying. I just remember Dad sleeping in the guest room. That was new. Ryan had never mentioned it, not once in our entire marriage. Memory is a strange thing. Sometimes the right piece of evidence unlocks doors that have been closed for decades. Diane carefully closed the planner. I'm not telling you your mother is evil. Ryan looked up. I'm telling you she believed protecting the family's reputation was more important than asking difficult questions. There it was, the motive. Not hatred, not cruelty for its own sake. Fear. Fear disguised as protection. Fear that admitting hereditary illness would somehow redefine the Olsen family forever. It didn't excuse anything, but it explained a great deal. As a healthcare provider, I'd met families like this before. Parents who delayed autism evaluations because they feared labels. Grandparents who hid depression because people didn't talk about those things. Adults who avoided genetic testing because they worried what neighbors might think. Shame often travels through generations more quietly than disease itself. The difference was that shame can influence choices, and choices have consequences. Ryan suddenly stood. "I'm calling Mom." I touched his arm. "What are you hoping she'll say?" "I don't know. He looked exhausted. "I need to hear her explain this." Diane gently shook her head. "Not over the phone." "Why?" "Because she'll deny everything before you've even finished asking." Ryan didn't argue, which told me he knew she was probably right. Instead, he slipped the phone back into his pocket. "So what do we do?" I answered before anyone else could. "We stop guessing." Ryan looked at me. "We organize everything." I pointed toward the growing stack of documents. "We have medical records, referral letters, your father's notes, the genetic report. But they're all from different years. We need a timeline." Dr. Carter had said exactly the same thing the previous day. Evidence only becomes meaningful when it's placed in context. Diane smiled. Thomas would have appreciated that. The next 3 hours felt less like a family visit and more like building a case file. Not for court, for understanding. We spread documents across the dining room table. I arranged everything chronologically. Oldest to newest, referral, appointment, cancellation, hospital admission, family history forms, specialist recommendations, genetic testing. Every document filled another gap. Ryan occasionally remembered another conversation with his father. Diane added dates. I made notes in the margins. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Thomas had repeatedly sought answers. Margaret had repeatedly minimized concerns. Years later, Margaret had answered every medical questionnaire for Ethan exactly the same way. No known family history. Each individual decision looked ordinary. Together, they painted a very different picture. Ryan stared at the timeline. "My God." "What?" "I've been saying the same thing to you for years." "What do you mean?" He looked directly at me. "Mom doesn't mean it." His voice cracked. I never stopped to ask whether intent was the right question. I reached for his hand. What matters now is what you do next." He nodded slowly. "For once, I'm not going to protect her before I know the whole truth." That was the first time since I'd met him that Ryan had separated loyalty from honesty. It was also the first moment I believed our marriage might actually survive this. As we packed the folders back into their boxes, Diane hesitated. I almost forgot. She walked into the hallway closet and returned carrying a thin manila envelope. "This came to me by mistake after your father died." Ryan frowned. "Why didn't you open it?" "I did. And then I realized it wasn't really mine." She handed it to him. Across the front was a return address from the office of Dr. Leonard Price. Inside was a single-page letter. At the bottom, someone had written in blue ink, "Please discuss these findings with your immediate family. Their health may depend on it." Ryan looked up sharply. "There should have been an appointment after this." "There was," Diane answered quietly. "Your father scheduled one." "What happened?" She looked away. "I don't know. But I do know one thing." "What?" "The appointment was never kept." Ryan turned the page over. Stapled to the back was something none of us expected to find. A photocopy of a visitor sign-in sheet from Dr. Price's office. Only one member of the Olsen family had checked in that morning. It wasn't Thomas. It was Margaret Olsen. Ryan read Margaret's name 3 times before saying it aloud. Mom. No one corrected him. No one questioned whether we were reading the document correctly. The visitor log was clear. Margaret Olsen, date October 28th, time 9:14 a.m. The appointment had originally been scheduled for Thomas Olson, but the only person who signed into Dr. Leonard Price's office that morning was Margaret. Ryan looked up at Aunt Diane. Did Dad know she went instead of him? Diane slowly shook her head. I honestly don't know. Then why would she be there? That, she answered quietly, is something only your mother can explain. I looked at the document again. As compelling as it appeared, I knew better than to jump to conclusions. A visitor log proved one thing. Margaret had gone to the office. It did not prove why. She could have been dropping off paperwork, picking up records, asking an insurance question. The possibilities mattered. Evidence only remains trustworthy when you resist the temptation to stretch it. Dr. Carter's words echoed in my mind. Separate facts from assumptions. I folded the visitor's sheet and placed it back into the envelope. We still need to hear her side. Ryan nodded. I agree. It was the first time since Easter that neither of us was talking about winning an argument. We were trying to understand the truth. 2 days later, Ryan called his mother. I'd like you to come over Saturday afternoon. For what? We need to talk. What about Dad? There was a long silence. Then Margaret laughed softly. After all these years? Yes. I don't see the point. I do. Another pause. Finally, she sighed. I'll come. She never asked whether I would be there. I suspected she already knew. Saturday arrived with gray skies and steady rain. Ada know? I reminded myself with a smile. I was Ada Olson, and this was my home. I made coffee. Ryan arranged 4 chairs around the dining room table, not in opposite corners, not like a courtroom, in a circle. That decision was deliberate. We weren't putting Margaret on trial. We were asking for honesty. Ethan spent the afternoon at my sister's house. Neither Ryan nor I wanted him anywhere near this conversation. At exactly 2 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Margaret stepped inside carrying a blueberry pie. I thought we could have dessert. Ryan accepted it politely. Thanks. She looked around. You two seem awfully serious. Then she noticed the folders on the dining room table. Her smile faded almost imperceptibly. What's all this? I answered calmly. We've been reviewing Ethan's medical history. Her shoulders stiffened. I thought his doctors finally had answers. They do. Wonderful. She started to sit down. Ryan spoke before she could. Mom. She looked at him. We also found Dad's medical records. For the first time since she'd arrived, Margaret looked genuinely unsettled. Only for a second. Then the familiar composure returned. I don't know why you dig through old files. Because they matter. She folded her arms. They mattered 20 years ago. They still matter. Ryan slid the referral letter across the table. Do you remember this? Margaret barely glanced at it. Your father saw so many doctors. I can't remember every piece of paper. I can understand that, Ryan replied. His voice remained surprisingly calm. What about this? He placed the visitor sign-in sheet beside it. Margaret's eyes stopped moving. She didn't touch the page. She didn't deny it. Instead, she looked at Ryan. Where did you get these? Aunt Diane. A flash of irritation crossed her face. I should have guessed. I noticed something important. She wasn't asking whether the documents were authentic. She already knew they were. Ryan leaned forward. Mom? Were you at Dr. Price's office instead of Dad that day? She hesitated. Yes. Why, I picked up paperwork. What paperwork? I don't remember. You don't remember. It was years ago. Ryan looked at me briefly before continuing. We're not accusing you of anything. We're trying to understand. Margaret exhaled heavily. I handled many of your father's appointments. I was trying to help." "I believe you wanted to help," Ryan said. "But that's not what I'm asking." He opened another folder. "This recommendation says genetic counseling was strongly advised for first-degree relatives." She stared at the sentence, still silent. Ryan continued. "Did you know doctors believed something hereditary might be affecting Dad?" Margaret looked down at the table. When she finally answered, her voice was almost too quiet to hear. "They weren't certain." "No, they weren't." Ryan nodded. "But they were concerned." Another silence. Then she whispered, "Yes." It was the first direct admission we'd heard. Not a confession, just one verified fact. She had known there was concern about a hereditary condition. I carefully placed Ethan's genetic report beside Thomas's referral. "I need to ask you something as Ethan's mother." Margaret finally looked at me. "When doctors repeatedly asked whether there was any endocrine disorder in Ryan's family, why did you always answer no?" She opened her mouth, closed it again, looked toward the kitchen window, then back at the papers. Her voice cracked. "I thought I was protecting everyone." Ryan frowned. "Protecting us from what?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "People talk." Neither of us responded. She continued. "You don't understand what it was like back then. If word spread that something ran in the Olsen family, your father was terrified clients would think he was too sick to run the business." She looked at Ryan. "We had 30 employees depending on us. The bank was reviewing loans. Every contract mattered." I listened carefully. She wasn't describing medical reasoning. She was describing fear. Fear of reputation. Fear of financial consequences. Fear of gossip. It wasn't an excuse, but for the first time her decisions made emotional sense. Ryan asked quietly, "So you decided not to tell doctors?" Margaret shook her head quickly. "It wasn't like that. She stopped speaking. I noticed her hands trembling. Then she said something that changed the direction of the entire conversation. "I never imagined your father was actually right." Ryan stared at her. "What do you mean?" She closed her eyes. "I thought if we ignored it, it would end with him." The room fell. The room fell completely silent. No one interrupted. No one judged. Because in that single sentence, Margaret had revealed the belief that had guided nearly every terrible decision she'd made for the last 20 years. Just then, someone knocked on the front door. Ryan looked confused. "We're not expecting anyone." "I was. I invited someone." Margaret turned toward me. "Who?" Before I could answer, the front door opened. Dr. Benjamin Carter stepped inside carrying a sealed hospital folder. He greeted everyone politely before placing the folder on the dining room table. "I appreciate you allowing me to join you." Then he looked directly at Margaret. "Mrs. Olsen, I believe it's time we reviewed what the medical records actually show." Margaret's eyes immediately settled on the hospital folder. It was sealed with a bright orange label that read, "Certified Medical Record Copy." No one reached for it. Dr. Benjamin Carter waited until everyone was seated again before taking his chair. "I want to be very clear about why I'm here," he began. "I'm not here to assign legal responsibility. I'm not here to shame anyone. I'm here because Mrs. Olsen asked whether I would explain Ethan's medical history in plain language so everyone involved would have the same information." He looked around the table. "Families often remember events differently. Medical records don't." That was one of the reasons I respected him so much. He never dramatized facts. He simply let them stand on their own. Ryan nodded. "Please." Dr. Carter broke the seal and removed several certified copies. Each page bore the hospital's watermark and certification stamp. He placed the first document in the center of the table. This is Ethan's admission summary from age 3. Then he placed the second beside it. This is the endocrine consultation. A third. The recommendation for expanded family history. And finally, Ethan's genetic report. The diagnosis confirmed this month. Margaret stared at the papers without touching them. Dr. Carter folded his hands. I'd like to walk through these chronologically. No one objected. He pointed to the oldest document. When Ethan was admitted at age 3, physicians recognized symptoms that didn't fit common childhood illnesses. He looked toward Ryan. Fatigue. Electrolyte imbalance. Intermittent muscle weakness. They weren't enough for a diagnosis. But they justified asking more questions. Ryan nodded slowly. I understand. Dr. Carter tapped the consultation note. That's why an endocrinologist recommended obtaining a detailed paternal family history. He looked at Margaret. The recommendation wasn't based on certainty. It was based on possibility. Margaret finally spoke. I remember. Her voice was barely audible. I honestly didn't think there was anything important. Dr. Carter nodded. I appreciate you saying that. Then he turned another page. This note documents that no relevant paternal history was reported. He paused long enough for everyone to read it themselves. No further genetic evaluation was pursued at that time. Ryan swallowed. So, that's where everything stopped. It slowed, Dr. Carter corrected. Medicine continued. Ethan continued receiving excellent care. New symptoms developed. Testing improved. And eventually we reached the correct diagnosis. He looked directly at me. Mrs. Olson advocated consistently for her son. I hadn't expected him to say that. Neither had Ryan. Dr. Carter continued. Every specialist she saw documented appropriate concern. She asked appropriate questions. She followed recommendations. There is nothing in this record suggesting Mrs. Olson caused Ethan's condition. Margaret closed her eyes. I realized she had spent years believing that if she repeated a story often enough, it would eventually become reality. Now every page in front of her quietly contradicted it. Ryan cleared his throat. Doctor, I need to ask something. Of course. If our family history had been complete from the beginning, would Ethan definitely have been diagnosed sooner? Dr. Carter answered exactly as I expected. I can't honestly say definitely. He leaned back in his chair. Medicine doesn't work that way. There are too many variables. Ryan nodded. I appreciate the honesty. What I can say, Dr. Carter continued, is that complete family history generally changes the direction of medical evaluation. He pointed toward the consultation note. This recommendation existed because someone recognized a possible hereditary pattern. If physicians had known there was documented concern involving Ethan's grandfather, additional genetic evaluation likely would have been considered earlier. The room became very quiet. He hadn't exaggerated. He hadn't minimized. He had simply explained the medical reality. Margaret slowly lifted her head. So, I didn't give Ethan this disease. No, Dr. Carter answered immediately. You did not. Fresh tears filled her eyes. But, he paused. The information physicians receive influences how they investigate disease. She looked down again. I understand. For the first time since Easter, there was no defensiveness in her voice, only exhaustion. Ryan reached across the table and gently pushed one document toward his mother. It wasn't the referral. It wasn't the visitor log. It wasn't Thomas's handwritten note. It was Ethan's genetic report. You know what hurts the most? Margaret looked at him. You spent years trying to convince everyone Ada caused something that science says existed before Ethan was even born. She didn't answer. Ryan continued quietly. She carried that blame. I let her carry part of it because I kept telling myself you meant well. He looked toward me. "I'm sorry." Those words were different from the apologies he'd offered over the years. Back then, he apologized for uncomfortable moments. Now he was accepting responsibility. I reached for his hand. "We're here now." He nodded. "But we should have been here years ago." Margaret suddenly stood and walked toward the living room window. Rain tapped softly against the glass. Without turning around, she spoke. "When Thomas first started getting sick, I was terrified." No one interrupted. "He wanted genetic testing. I wanted normal." She laughed bitterly. "Those aren't always the same thing." She rested one hand against the window. I kept thinking, if we didn't give the doctors another family member to worry about, maybe they would decide it wasn't hereditary. Dr. Carter spoke gently. "Unfortunately, diseases don't disappear because families stop talking about them." "I know." Her voice broke. "I know that now." She finally turned back toward us. "I never lied because I wanted Ethan to suffer. I lied because I thought I could keep the future from happening." There it was, the truth beneath every decision she'd made. Fear, not hatred. Fear powerful enough to distort judgment for decades. It explained her actions. It didn't erase their consequences. Margaret walked slowly back to the table. She stopped beside Ethan's genetic report. "I owe someone an apology." Ryan looked at her but said nothing. She shook her head. "Not you." She looked directly at me. "I've spent years apologizing to adults whenever I hurt them." Then she glanced toward the family photo sitting on the bookshelf. A picture of Ethan smiling with a baseball glove almost bigger than he was. "I've never apologized to the person who was actually carrying my words." My chest tightened. She wasn't looking at me anymore. She was looking at Ethan's photograph. "I called him a mistake." Her voice trembled. "And I made him believe something was wrong with him that had nothing to do with who he is." She took a long breath. "If he'll let me, I'd like to tell him that myself." Ryan looked at me. Neither of us answered immediately. Some apologies deserve to be heard. Others must first be earned. I finally spoke. "Whether you see Ethan isn't the first question." Margaret looked at me. "The first question is whether you can respect the boundaries that will protect him from ever hearing those words again." She nodded slowly. "I understand." I wasn't sure she fully did, not yet, but for the first time in 8 years, she had stopped defending herself long enough to hear what the real damage had been. The house felt strangely quiet after Dr. Carter left. Margaret remained seated at the dining room table, staring at the stack of certified medical records. Ryan began gathering the papers into neat folders, placing each document in chronological order. It wasn't just housekeeping. It felt symbolic. For years, our family history had been scattered across half-truths, assumptions, and selective memories. Now it finally existed in one place, complete, verified, honest. I slipped each document into a waterproof expanding file. Thomas's referral, the hospital intake forms, the endocrinology consultation, the genetic report, the physician's recommendations. Every page had earned its place there. As a nurse practitioner, I had always taught parents to keep organized medical records for children with chronic conditions. Now I understood another reason. Sometimes records don't just protect health, they protect truth. Margaret finally broke the silence. "What happens now?" I looked at Ryan before answering. He nodded silently, telling me to speak for both of us. "The medical treatment doesn't change." Dr. Carter had already explained Ethan's care plan. The medications remained the same. His follow-up appointments would continue every few months. Regular laboratory monitoring would still be necessary. The difference was that every specialist who cared for Ethan would now receive complete family history. no one would waste years asking the same unanswered questions again. Margaret nodded slowly. I meant, she hesitated, our family. I know. I folded my hands together. Our family also changes. She lowered her eyes. I suppose it has to. It does. I had spent several days thinking about this conversation, not because I wanted punishment, because I wanted clarity. There is a difference. For years, I confused peace with avoiding conflict. I smiled politely. I changed subjects. I accepted apologies that were really explanations. I convinced myself that preserving harmony was the same thing as protecting Ethan. It wasn't. Children don't need adults to pretend everything is fine. They need adults willing to make hard decisions, especially when those decisions make other adults uncomfortable. I reached into my notebook. Unlike the hospital records, these pages were entirely mine. I had written them after talking with Ethan's therapist earlier that week. Not because Ethan had a mental illness, because after hearing a grandparent repeatedly imply that something was wrong with him, I wanted professional guidance on helping him rebuild confidence. The therapist had given me several recommendations. One sentence had stayed with me. Children heal faster when the adults around them become predictable. Predictable, not perfect. Consistent, safe. I looked at Margaret. I'm going to explain exactly what Ryan and I have decided. She nodded. I'm listening. No surprises. No guessing. No assumptions. I appreciated that. It meant she understood this wasn't going to be a negotiation. The first boundary I said is about Ethan. You'll only spend time with him when either Ryan or I are present. She nodded immediately. I understand. The second. If he asks medical questions, Ryan and I answer them. You don't. Again she nodded. The third. You never describe Ethan as fragile, broken, difficult, or a burden. I won't. The fourth. If another family member repeats the story that I caused Ethan's condition, you'll correct it. That one took longer. Margaret looked surprised. You want me to tell everyone. I want you to tell the truth. She looked down. I can do that. I believed she meant it. Whether she would actually follow through remained to be seen. Trust returns slowly. Sometimes it never returns completely. Ryan spoke for the first time in nearly 15 minutes. I have one boundary too. Margaret looked at him. Any future medical appointment involving Ethan. Ada and I handle it. You don't fill out paperwork. You don't answer family history questions. You don't speak for us. She looked hurt. I wasn't trying to replace you. I know. Ryan's voice remained calm. But that's exactly what happened. She closed her eyes, then quietly answered, You're right. It was probably the hardest sentence she'd spoken all afternoon. 3 weeks passed. Life gradually returned to something resembling normal. Ethan continued baseball practice. School started preparing for its spring science fair. Ryan took a few days off work so he could attend Ethan's specialist appointment with me. This time, when the nurse asked about family history, Ryan answered first. We have updated information. He handed over the complete medical summary. The endocrinologist looked through the documents carefully. This will be very helpful. Such a simple sentence. Yet hearing it filled me with relief. For the first time since Ethan was a toddler, every physician involved in his care had the complete picture. Nothing hidden, nothing minimized, nothing left to speculation. Margaret kept her distance. She didn't call every day anymore. She didn't stop by unexpectedly. She sent Ethan birthday cards. She mailed him a puzzle book. Once she asked Ryan whether she could attend one of his Little League games. Instead of answering immediately, Ryan asked Ethan, How do you feel about Grandma coming? That question mattered. For years, adults had made decisions around Ethan. Now we were inviting him into age-appropriate conversations about his own comfort. He thought for a long moment. Can she just watch? Of course. I don't want everyone talking. They won't. At the game, Margaret arrived early. She sat alone in the third row of the aluminum bleachers. She didn't wave dramatically. She didn't call Ethan's name. She simply watched. After the game ended, Ethan walked toward her carrying his baseball glove. Ryan and I stayed several feet away, close enough to step in if necessary, far enough to let Ethan decide. Margaret knelt in front of him. For several seconds, she couldn't speak. Finally, she whispered, I need to tell you something. Ethan listened quietly. I'm very sorry for what I said at Easter. You should never have heard those words. They weren't true. You were never a mistake. You never will be. Ethan looked at her with the direct honesty only children possess. My mom told me sick people aren't mistakes. Margaret's eyes immediately filled with tears. Your mom was right, and I was wrong. There was no excuse, no explanation, no mention of Thomas, no discussion of family reputation, just responsibility. Exactly what Ethan deserved. He thought about her apology for a moment, then he gave a small nod. Okay. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, just acknowledgement. Children often understand the difference better than adults do. As we walked back to the car, Ethan slipped his hand into mine. Mom. Yes, sweetheart. He looked up at me. His expression was thoughtful rather than sad. Does Grandma finally believe none of this was your fault? The question lingered between us as I looked through the windshield at Margaret still sitting alone on the bleachers long after everyone else had left. I realized my answer would shape far more than Ethan's opinion of his grandmother. It would shape how he understood accountability for the rest of his life. I looked at Ethan for a few seconds before answering. Children notice hesitation. If adults rush to fill every silence, they often miss the opportunity to tell the truth in a way children can actually understand. I think Grandma believes it now, I finally said, but believing something and repairing the hurt it caused are two different things. Ethan considered that quietly. So, saying sorry doesn't fix everything. I smiled gently. No. It starts something. It doesn't finish it. He nodded as if that made perfect sense. In many ways, it probably did. Children understand fairness long before adults give them enough credit for it. 6 months passed. Ethan's health gradually stabilized. The correct diagnosis allowed his endocrinology team to adjust his treatment plan with far greater precision. His energy slowly returned. He still had regular blood work and specialist appointments, but they no longer felt like desperate attempts to solve an impossible mystery. Now they felt like routine care. There is tremendous peace in finally knowing what you're treating. Ryan never missed another appointment. He learned how to read Ethan's laboratory reports. He asked thoughtful questions. He kept medication schedules on his phone. Sometimes I caught him reading medical journals late at night. Not because he didn't trust the doctors, because he wanted to understand what our son was living with. One evening, he closed his laptop and looked at me. I've been thinking about something. What? I kept telling myself I was staying neutral. I waited. I wasn't. He shook his head. I was protecting the person who made me comfortable instead of protecting the people who depended on me. Those words meant more to me than any apology he had ever offered. Real accountability changes behavior. Ryan had changed. Not overnight, not dramatically, steadily. That was enough. Margaret also changed. More slowly, more quietly. She stopped presenting herself as the authority on everyone's life. At family gatherings, she listened more than she spoke. When relatives asked about Ethan's health, she answered simply, "Ada and Ryan know his care better than anyone." The first time I heard her say that, I almost didn't recognize her voice. Several months earlier, she would have explained his condition herself. Now she stepped back. It wasn't surrender, it was respect. One afternoon, she called me. Not Ryan, me. "I wanted to ask something." "I'm listening." "Our church is hosting a fundraiser for children with rare diseases." "I was wondering," she hesitated, "would you be willing to speak?" "Why, I honestly wasn't expecting the invitation. You want me to? I think people should hear from someone who actually understands." I took a long breath. "I'll do it. There was one condition. I won't tell Ethan's story to make people feel guilty." "I know. I want to explain why honest family medical history matters." Margaret answered softly, "I think that's exactly what needs to be heard." The community fundraiser took place on a bright Saturday afternoon. Families filled the church fellowship hall. Local physicians, nurses, teachers, parents, children. Dr. Benjamin Carter had also been invited to speak about advances in pediatric genetic medicine. When my turn came, I walked onto the small stage carrying no notes. I looked across the audience before beginning. I've spent my career teaching parents that asking questions is never something to be ashamed of. Several heads nodded. Sometimes families hide medical information because they're afraid. Afraid of labels. Afraid of judgment. Afraid of what people might think. I paused. But our bodies don't protect our secrets. Our honesty protects each other. The room remained completely silent. I continued. Accurate family history doesn't guarantee perfect outcomes, but it gives physicians the information they need to ask better questions. And sometimes, better questions change lives. When I finished, the audience applauded politely. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical, exactly the way I wanted it. Afterwards, several parents approached me, not to discuss my family, to ask about advocating for their own children. That mattered far more. As people began leaving, Ethan tugged gently on my sleeve. "Mom?" "What is it?" He pointed toward the table near the back of the room. Margaret was sitting with another grandmother whose grandson had recently been diagnosed with a hereditary disorder. I watched Margaret quietly say, "If the doctors ask about family history, tell them everything, even the parts that are uncomfortable." The other woman nodded gratefully. Margaret never mentioned herself. She didn't tell our story. She simply passed on the lesson she had learned too late. I realized then that remorse isn't measured by tears. It's measured by what people do after no one is forcing them to change. As we walked to the parking lot, Ethan reached for both my hand and Ryan's. He looked up at us with the bright confidence I'd missed for so many years. "I don't think about what Grandma said anymore." Ryan smiled. "What do you think about my science project?" I laughed. "That's a much better thing to think about." He grinned. "And baseball. Definitely baseball." We loaded the car together. Before closing the passenger door, Ethan suddenly looked at me. "You know something." "What?" "I think Grandpa Thomas would have wanted everybody to tell the truth." I felt my eyes sting. "I think you're right." Thomas Olson had spent years searching for answers he never lived long enough to receive. His notes, his referrals, his determination to understand his own health had eventually helped protect a grandson he would never meet. Not because of fate, not because of luck, because someone preserved the evidence, because good physicians kept accurate records, because one family finally chose truth over appearances. As we drove home beneath the warm spring sunset, I realized something that had taken me 8 years to understand. Justice hadn't come from humiliating Margaret. Healing hadn't come from proving I was right. Both arrived the moment our family stopped protecting a false story and started protecting the people living inside the real one. And when Ethan leaned forward from the back seat and quietly said, "Mom, now I know nothing about me was ever a mistake," I knew that was the only ending that had ever truly mattered. Some family wounds begin with a single sentence, but they are rarely healed by a single apology. When the people closest to us choose comfort over truth, the damage can last for years. Yet this story is also a reminder that healthy boundaries are not acts of revenge. They are acts of protection. They create the space where trust can be rebuilt if the other person is willing to earn it. If you've ever been blamed for something that was never your fault, I hope you remember this: forgiving someone does not require giving them the same access they once had. Reconciliation and restored trust are different things. One can happen without the other. It is okay to protect yourself and the people you love while still wishing someone healing. The strongest families are not the ones that hide difficult truths. They are the ones courageous enough to face them together, even when those truths are uncomfortable. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to set boundaries with someone you loved? If you're comfortable sharing, leave a comment below. Your story may encourage someone else who feels alone. And if stories about family resilience, justice, and healing resonate with you, I'd be honored if you subscribed and joined this community. This is a fictional story created for entertainment, education, and reflection.